This is Dr. Stansel, and the lecture is titled Argument Evaluation, Validity, and Soundness. What is the function of an argument? What is its job? It should give rational justification for a point of view. It should state premises which support its conclusion. When we evaluate an argument, we assess how well it does its job or how well it performs the function it's supposed to perform. That is, we are asking, do the premises adequately support the conclusion? It's important to note that when we evaluate an argument, we are not asking whether we think the conclusion is true. That's actually irrelevant. Rather, we're looking at how well the premises support the conclusion. There are many approaches we can take to evaluating arguments. In this lecture, I'll be talking about two approaches. The first is to ask, is the argument valid? And the second is to ask, is the argument sound? So we'll start by defining validity and what we mean by that in the field of philosophy. There is a standard definition for this concept. Validity is defined as a certain logical relationship between the premises and the conclusion. And this is the relationship. If all the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. So what we're looking at here is the fit between the premises and the conclusion. The premises don't actually need to be true for an argument to be valid. They just have to have the right kind of logical relationship with the conclusion. This is a classic example. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. If these two premises are true, then it also must be true that Socrates is mortal. This is a valid argument. If we were to find that actually not all men are mortal, that some men are immortal, and there have been perhaps some examples of that throughout history. So if we were to find that the first premise was not true, this is still a valid argument because it's still true that if P1 and P2 are true, then the conclusion must also be true. One way to evaluate an argument is to ask whether it's valid and answer that question. And when we ask if the argument is valid, we're going to either be answering yes, it's valid, or no, it's not valid. And what I'm doing on this slide is I'm giving you a basic sense of what your answer would need to contain. And these are like templates. And then in the next couple of slides, I'll give you examples and show you how this looks in action. But first, let me just talk you through these templates. So if we think that an argument is valid, we might say something like this. The argument is valid if it's true that, and then we describe some of the key premises of the argument. Then it must be true that, and then we state the conclusion. So this is suggested wording. You don't have to use this wording, but this is some wording that you can use to put your answer together. In this kind of answer, it's important that you highlight only the key premises that make the argument valid. You won't necessarily include all the premises of the argument, and you may not include all the key premises of the argument. On the next slide, I'll talk about what I mean by a key premise, and then in the example that I'll give, you'll see how I have selected just a few premises to highlight to show validity. What if we're answering no, the argument isn't valid? Then we could use wording like this: the argument is not valid. Even if all the premises are true, the conclusion is not necessarily true because, and then you have to explain. And you have to think about, suppose all the premises are true. Why might that still not be enough reason to determine that the conclusion is true? And I think the example will be really helpful for you to see what I'm talking about here and how you might do an evaluation like this. But before we get to examples, I just want to make a really important reminder is that if you are arguing that an argument is not valid, you want to say, even if all the premises are true, the conclusion is not necessarily true. You don't want to say the conclusion's false, because this goes back to earlier in the lecture where I said the point of an evaluation is not to give our view on the conclusion. The point of an evaluation is to assess whether the premises adequately do their job of supporting the conclusion. So it's really important when you're doing evaluation to not give your opinion of the conclusion, because that's really irrelevant. What we're really looking at is the way the premises support that conclusion. And so you want to stay focused there. What we're really saying when we're saying an argument isn't valid is that the premises are not enough to ensure that the conclusion is true. Before we get to the examples, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by a key premise. Sometimes arguments can have premises that are really unnecessary, extra fluff. These premises could be cut and the argument would still work just as well without them. Sometimes they're just repetitive, where we have numerous premises saying the same thing, maybe in different ways, and so we could cut most of them. A key premise is necessary for supporting the conclusion. The argument can't work if this premise is cut. So when we do argument evaluation, we want to focus on the key premises. And the other premises that are extra, or like sometimes I call them fluff, we don't want to focus on those. Because, let's say one of those premises turns out to be false. It doesn't really matter because the key premises could still be enough to support that argument. Okay, so when we're doing evaluation, we need to focus on the key premises and try to determine whether the key premises are enough to support the conclusion, and ignore the other premises. For this process. So we want to be able to determine which premises are key premises and which are not. And one way to do that is to just go premise by premise and ask, does the argument work if this premise is cut? You can imagine it being cut from the argument. You can draw a line through it, whatever works for you. If the argument will work just as well if the premise is cut, then it's not a key premise. But if the argument can't function if the premise is cut, then it is a key premise. One approach to doing argument evaluation is to begin with an argument reconstruction of the argument and then go through premise by premise and determine which premises are key premises and mark them, and then move forward from there, because that'll help you focus on the key premises that you need to focus on. Let's look at our first example. this is an argument for vegetarianism, and on the next slide, I will evaluate it and show that it's valid. But before we get there, let me ask you first to pause for a moment and take some time to read through the argument. And then when you unpause the lecture, I will talk about why I labeled P2, P4, and P6 as key premises and not the other ones. Okay, so after reading the argument, you should see that P4 is really the heart of this argument. It says we are morally required to reduce suffering when we can. If that's true, and if it's true that animals suffer when slaughtered, then we should reduce that suffering as long as we're able to. P6 says we are able to eliminate this form of suffering because it's not necessary to eat meat. So P2, P4, and P6 work together to build a line of reasoning that has to do with the suffering caused by animal slaughter together with the moral imperative to reduce suffering. Okay, and so that is how this argument supports its conclusion. So P2, P4, and P6 are necessary. They are key premises of the argument. Let's look at the other ones that I did not mark as key premises. P1 says about 25 million farm animals are slaughtered each day. And I'm not sure about that number, but the thing is, it doesn't really matter. What matters is whether suffering is being caused. And it doesn't matter if 25 million animals are suffering or if one animal is suffering. If there's any suffering being caused, P4 says we're morally required to reduce suffering when we can. So it's about the suffering, and it's not about the number of animals. Okay, so P1's not a key premise. P3 says the meat industry causes enormous suffering. And that's definitely related to how this argument functions, but I'm not counting it as a key premise because P2 says just about the same thing. It says animals suffer when slaughtered. So since P3 is repetitive, I'm not marking it as a key premise. P3 could be cut from the argument and the argument would still function. So it's not a key premise. P5 says eating meat is part of our culture. And, this is not further discussed or explained. It doesn't mention suffering. So this is really kind of almost out of left field. It doesn't relate to the heart of how this argument functions to show that vegetarianism is required. So it's not a key premise. And in the readings that we'll have, you will often see authors who are working really hard to build a line of reasoning where their premises all work together to support the conclusion, but then they have some side comment that they want to throw in. And they do. They throw it in there, and you might mistake it for a premise, but, this P5, we can call it a premise of the argument, but it's not a key premise. It can be cut, and the rest of the argument functions just as well without it. Okay, so that's why I am not labeling it as a key premise. Here's my evaluation showing that the argument is valid. So I'll start off by saying this argument is valid. It's really good to do that. It's really good to be very clear so that whoever's reading your answer will know what you're trying to say. Okay, if it's true that animals suffer when slaughtered, and we are morally required to reduce suffering when we can, and we can live without eating meat, then the conclusion that vegetarianism is morally required must also be true. Period. the end. That's my evaluation. So let's look at what I've done here. First, I said the argument's valid. And then I said, if it's true that, and I named, I wrote out really my three key premises. Um, if it's true that, P2, P4, P6, then the conclusion that, and I wrote out the conclusion that vegetarianism is morally required must also be true. So this evaluation, if you'll go back 3 slides, you'll see that I gave you a template for how to write out your answer to show that an argument is valid. And I use that template here, and I just kind of filled in the blanks with the premises and the conclusion. The work that I had to do in this evaluation is really identifying which premises to include. And you can see I included the 3 key premises, and all of those premises work together to create a valid argument. And we can use our own innate sense of logic to look at this and think about it. If animals suffer when slaughtered, and if we're morally required to reduce suffering when we can, and if we can cut meat from our diet, then we should. And this all follows, and it's logical. So I've shown that the argument is valid. Now notice that validity, as I said before, doesn't have anything to do with whether the premises are true. So you might say, hey, some people can't cut meat from their diet and still be healthy or still survive. That's not an issue to bring up when we're talking about validity. That is something to bring up when we're talking about soundness, and I'll get to that later in the lecture. Here's our second example, and for this argument, I'm going to be arguing that it is not valid. So if you remember from a couple slides back when I gave you the basic templates for showing that an argument is valid versus showing that an argument is not valid, when we're showing that an argument is not valid, we don't need to highlight certain key premises of that argument. So in this example, I have not marked the premises as key premises. Again, I'm going to be showing that it's not valid, so I didn't need to identify key premises. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and pause the lecture, read the argument, and then go on to the next slide where you'll see my evaluation showing that this argument is not valid. Here's my evaluation, and as before, I used the template that I provided to you all a couple slides back. I start by saying the argument is not valid, and then I say even if all the premises are true, the conclusion is not necessarily true because, okay, all of that wording comes from the template. And then now I've got to fill in that blank of the template and explain why, even if the premises are all true, the conclusion is not necessarily true. So let me read how I have done that. Okay. Because students who turn in work late had more time to do the work than others. This gives them an unfair advantage, since additional time gives them the opportunity to raise the quality of their work. The first premise of the argument says students should get the same chance to do well. Allowing some students extra time goes against that. Well, this is what I thought worked with this argument. And whenever you evaluate an argument and you're asking whether it's valid, there can be many different ways that it might fail to be valid, and there may be many different reasons that you might give for, even if all the premises are true, the conclusion is not necessarily true because. And you really have to take each argument on a case-by-case basis and think about it. Think about, first of all, you have to imagine that all the premises are true. And this can be tricky if you don't agree with some of those premises, but you have to use your imagination. Imagine that they're all true. Does that mean the conclusion is necessarily true? And you want to look at the conclusion and think about the real breadth of what the conclusion is claiming. We can have conclusions to arguments that make weaker, more limited claims. We can have conclusions that make really broad claims. So take a few minutes to think about what all is this conclusion actually claiming. And then think about the premises again. If supposing they're all true, does that mean the conclusion has to be true? And you'll have your own reflections and insights about that, and that's what becomes the content for the evaluation. Now we get to soundness. An argument is sound when it's valid and all the premises are true. So I had to define validity before defining soundness because an argument has to be valid to be sound. Soundness is what we really care about when we're looking at an argument. We want it to be valid and we want all the premises to be true. If an argument is sound, it's really strong. It's really compelling. And, soundness represents the gold standard for arguments in ethics. We can evaluate an argument by determining whether it's sound. But to show that an argument is sound, we have to go through all the steps of showing that it's valid. And then we have to show each of the key premises is true or should be considered true. And we have to give a reason for each one. And this ends up being a really lengthy process. To show that an argument is not sound can be quicker because if we can show that it's not valid, then it's also not sound. Or if we can show that at least one key premise is false, we have shown that it's not sound. But because it's such a long process to show that an argument is sound, I don't ask my students to do this. The other reason is that when ethicists are debating about moral issues, and when popular writers are writing op-ed pieces for newspapers and magazines and talking about moral issues, nobody goes through all the steps of determining the soundness of arguments that they're writing about. It's just too lengthy and it's cumbersome. It's really the kind of thing that you might expect to do in a homework assignment for a class, but that you're not going to see out in a more live, natural setting where debates about moral issues are actually occurring. So going through all the steps of showing that an argument is sound is not something that happens kind of in the wild, so to speak, of where our culture is really talking about moral issues. So that's another reason why I don't have my students do it. Instead, I may ask you, are all the key premises of this argument true? So it can be more manageable to ask about validity in one question, and then in another question, ask whether you think all the key premises are true. Okay, so I'm gonna show you how to answer that question. If you believe that all the key premises of the argument are true, you need to either name or state each premise and give your reason why you think it should be accepted as true. If the premise makes an is claim, you need to offer some factual evidence that it's true, and please cite your source and give a web link where you found the information if at all possible. If the premise makes an ought claim, then you need to give moral reasons why you think that that ought claim should be accepted as true. And please be careful and thoughtful with how you do that. Don't be too quick, don't rush through it. Make sure you give an ample explanation as to why you believe that ought claim is compelling. Okay, if you don't think all the key premises are true, then you just need to identify one key premise and prove that it's false. So if it is an is claim, you can bring forth evidence that shows that that is claim is false. And again, please, name your source and provide a web link. If the key premise that you're targeting makes an ought claim, you need to explain why this moral claim is not acceptable and give reasons and be thoughtful about that. Okay, so after you have talked about the one key premise that you think fails and why it fails, then you need to explain why this means that the conclusion no longer follows or the conclusion is now not necessarily true. I have some suggested wording, and these are like templates again. You can use them, you don't have to, but you can use something like, it's not true that blank. You would state the premise that you're targeting in that blank because blank. And in that second blank, you give the reasons why that targeted premise should not be considered true. And then this secondary bullet here, since this premise is not true, the conclusion is not necessarily true because, and then that's where you have to explain how the failure of that premise that you've identified means that now the argument can't support its conclusion. Okay, this is a lot and it's hard to think about it in the abstract. So I've got some examples coming up and I'll show you how this can look in practice, and I think that'll be really helpful. Here's my evaluation, and let's look at it. The claims the author makes about laws and punishment are all true according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services website, and then include a web link for that. So this is how I approached proving several of the premises of the argument true all in one sentence, because I could point to one website for all of them. Now, that won't always happen when you're trying to show that all key premises are true. If it works out, if you can do it that way for some of the premises and sort of bundle them, that's great. But if you can't do that, you're going to need to talk about each premise one by one and give evidence that each one is true. Now, and that's for the is claims. What about any ought claims that appear in the premises? Most arguments that we read will have them. Those require a little more discussion. I can't just point to a website. So let's look at how I handled this in the sample answer. Further, it's morally wrong to harm yourself. That was one of the premises of the argument. Now I need to explain why I think it's morally wrong to harm yourself, and here's how I did it. It's wrong to harm others, and this is one of the most fundamental moral tenets. If it's wrong to harm others and all people are equal, it's wrong to harm yourself. All premises of the argument are true or should be considered true. Okay, so that's my evaluation. I want to point out that in my evaluation, I give a reason why each premise should be considered true, and all the reasons I gave were original. It's really important that you bring new evidence and new considerations when you do an evaluation of this type. So sometimes a student might try to sort of recycle content from the argument itself in showing that premises of the argument are true, but that doesn't really, that's kind of like trying to pull yourself up from your own bootstraps, as the saying goes. It doesn't help to show that the argument's premises are true, to just sort of recycle content from the argument itself. And I want my students to do more work than that. I want you to look outside of the argument, and think about reasons why these premises should be accepted as true. So be careful to do that. Here's our last example of the lecture. And on the next slide, I'll be evaluating this argument, and I will be arguing that not all of the premises are true. So let me ask you here to first take a moment, read through the argument. You might pause the lecture, and then when you're ready, hit play again, and you'll go to the next slide and see my evaluation. My evaluation shows that not all the premises are true, and so here's how I did that. The author refers to plastic bags as non-recyclable, but plastic grocery bags are recyclable. See ridwell.com. If you go to that website, they talk about their plastic bag recycling program. Therefore, they don't necessarily harm the environment, and so the conclusion stating that a plastic bag ban is morally required is not necessarily true. Okay, so if you'll refer back to the template for this type of evaluation that I shared with you earlier, it's got two steps or two elements. And in the first step, I need to pinpoint a key premise, which I think is false, and give a reason why it's false. So there is a premise that says plastic bags are non-recyclable and a source of waste. So that's the premise that I pinpointed. I give a reason why it's false by stating that plastic grocery bags are recyclable, and then I cite my source. And I've included a web link in the answer, and that's what you should do too. Well, when you're attacking an is claim, if you're attacking an ought claim, then you need to give your own moral reasons why that claim is false. And you don't have to give a web link. Okay, now in the second step of the evaluation, I have to talk about how the failure of that premise undermines the ability of the argument to support the conclusion. So I've done that by saying, therefore, plastic bags don't necessarily harm the environment, and so the conclusion stating that a plastic bag ban is morally required is not necessarily true. The conclusion is based on the idea that we should ban things that harm the environment. But now that we know plastic bags don't necessarily harm the environment, the conclusion banning plastic bags is not necessarily true. I want to be careful to avoid saying this conclusion is false, plastic bags should be allowed, or something really strong like that. Because again, an argument evaluation is not the place to share your own opinion of the issue. It's not your place to evaluate the conclusion. All we're doing is we're looking at how well the premises do the job of supporting the conclusion. And what I'm doing in this evaluation is I'm showing that one of these key premises is not true, and therefore the premises don't adequately support the conclusion. What does this mean? It means the conclusion might be true, it might not be true. We don't necessarily know. What we do know is that the premises don't show that the conclusion has to be true, which is what the premises are trying to do, right? So, all I'm really trying to do here is show that the argument has failed to prove that the conclusion is definitely true. Conclusion might be true, might not be true. That's not for me to say. Be careful when you're writing argument evaluations. It's not the time to make your own argument on the topic. And it's not an evaluation of the conclusion itself. So I talked about that with the last slide, but I'm just emphasizing that here. What you're doing when you do an evaluation is evaluating whether the premises adequately support the conclusion. When I ask students to evaluate arguments, a whole range of answers is possible, and many strong answers are possible. Our evaluations are often going to be based on insights that we have about the argument and about the moral issue, and different students can have different insights. So, there won't be one particular answer that I'm looking for, but I am looking for your answers to utilize the techniques that I've taught in the lecture, to utilize the vocabulary such as validity and soundness properly and effectively. I'm looking for you to really think about these arguments and whether they're valid, whether all the premises are true. So, your answer to an evaluation question might be short, but take time to think about it and take time to write it. A couple of reminders. Make sure you are targeting key premises of the argument. Don't spend time in an evaluation writing about premises that are not key premises. Sometimes I call those fluff. These premises can be cut from the argument and they might be false, but the key premises of the argument are still enough to support the conclusion. So that's where our focus has to be. Take time to explain your thoughts well. Make sure that your comments are directly relevant to the question of whether the premises support the conclusion or to the question of validity or soundness. And the content that you include in your evaluations, it should be reasonable and it should be believable. So for factual claims, I'm asking you to cite your source and include a web link where I can find that content. And that helps me to score your work, but it also helps you to make sure that the content you're putting in your evaluation is really strong. And for your discussions of ought claims or moral reasons that appear in an argument when you're evaluating them, your discussion should be reasonable and believable. So, most often, what you need to do is just make sure you're explaining your ideas well enough.